Maps flicker onto the screen. The curved outline of the Caribbean, the narrow strait between Cuba and Florida, and a widening circle showing the reach of nuclear missiles. Grainy photographs of missile launchers fade into iconic images of mushroom clouds boiling into the sky. Against this backdrop, October 1962 comes into focus as the month when, for 13 days, the world edged closer to nuclear war than ever before. In Washington and Moscow, in Havana and Berlin, leaders and ordinary citizens alike lived with the same gnawing question. Would this be the moment the Cold War turned hot? At the center of the drama stood three men whose decisions would shape the fate of millions. John F. Kennedy, the young American president still recovering from the bruises of earlier crises. Nikita Khrushchev, the impulsive and theatrical leader of the Soviet Union, determined to protect his revolution and assert Soviet power. And Fidel Castro, the fiery Cuban revolutionary who had defied the United States and now found himself a pawn and a player in a superpower confrontation. Around them loomed the larger shadow of the Cold War. Rival ideologies, competing alliances, and an arms race that had transformed human destruction into a matter of minutes. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not appear out of nowhere. It grew from years of escalating tension and a nuclear arms race that had already produced enough warheads to devastate civilization. The United States and the Soviet Union had embraced a grim logic: mutually assured destruction. Each side built arsenals capable of annihilating the other, even after suffering a devastating first strike. In theory, this balance of terror would discourage either side from starting a nuclear war. In practice, it meant that any miscalculation, any misread signal, could trigger a catastrophe that no one truly wanted. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, crises flared across the Cold War landscape. Berlin, a divided city deep inside East Germany, became a recurring flashpoint. The construction of a wall to stem the flow of refugees symbolized the hardening of the Iron Curtain. US reconnaissance flights, including high-altitude U-2 missions over Soviet territory, probed for information and provoked anger in Moscow when they were exposed. Each incident added another layer of mistrust, another scar to the relationship between the superpowers. In the Western Hemisphere, a different revolution was reshaping the map. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's overthrow of a US-backed dictator stunned Washington. What began as a nationalist revolution soon aligned with the Soviet Union as Castro embraced socialism and denounced American influence. The United States responded with economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and covert efforts to undermine the new regime. Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, had slipped from America's orbit and into the embrace of its greatest rival. The turning point came with a failed invasion. A force of Cuban exiles, backed and trained by the United States, landed on a remote stretch of Cuban coastline in an attempt to topple Castro's government. The operation collapsed in humiliation. For Kennedy, it was an early and painful defeat. For Castro, it was proof that the United States was willing to use force to overthrow him. And for Khrushchev, it was a lesson. If the Soviet Union wanted to preserve its new ally in the Caribbean, it would have to be prepared to defend Cuba more directly and more dramatically. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced his own strategic dilemma. The United States possessed a larger and more accurate arsenal of long-range missiles and bombers, many of them stationed close to Soviet territory. American nuclear weapons ringed the Soviet Union from bases in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Soviet leaders worried about a perceived missile gap in favor of the United States and about the vulnerability of their own homeland to a sudden strike. To Khrushchev, the situation seemed intolerable, both militarily and politically. The decision that followed would reshape history. In close consultations with his military and political advisors, Khrushchev approved a bold plan: secretly deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. If successful, the move would place American cities within easy reach of Soviet medium and intermediate range missiles, dramatically altering the strategic balance. It would also serve as a shield for Castro's regime, deterring any future US invasion by making the stakes unimaginably high. The operation depended on speed, deception, and discipline. Soviet ships began to slip out of Black Sea and Baltic ports, carrying troops, missiles, launchers, and support equipment. To conceal their cargo, they used false manifests and elaborate cover stories. On the ground in Cuba, Soviet technicians and soldiers worked with Cuban authorities to unload the shipments at night, move them inland, and construct launch sites hidden among fields, forests, and hills. Camouflage nets and dummy structures were used to disguise the true nature of the installations from prying eyes in the sky. For Castro, the arrival of Soviet missiles was more than a military arrangement. It was a chance to deter another invasion, to elevate Cuba's status on the world stage, and to bind his revolution more tightly to the Soviet bloc. But it was also a gamble. Hosting nuclear weapons made Cuba a central target in any conflict between the superpowers. Castro, convinced that the United States was determined to destroy him, accepted that risk in the name of survival and ideology. While Soviet freighters crossed the Atlantic and construction crews in Cuba prepared the missile sites, American intelligence continued its routine surveillance. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, flying at high altitude, periodically photographed the island, searching for signs of unusual activity. For months, the Soviet operation remained undetected, shielded by secrecy and by a temporary reduction in overflights due to political concerns and weather. Then, in mid-October, a single flight changed everything. A U-2 mission returned with a series of crisp black and white photographs that, when laid out on light tables at the Central Intelligence Agency, told a chilling story. Analysts, trained to recognize the shapes and patterns of missile installations, saw long cylindrical objects on trailers, launch pads under construction, and support equipment consistent with nuclear-capable missiles. These were not defensive anti-aircraft systems. They were offensive weapons, capable of striking deep into the United States. Over the next hours and days, teams of photo interpreters and intelligence officers pored over the images. They identified missile types, estimated ranges, and assessed how quickly the sites could become operational. The conclusion was stark. The Soviet Union was in the process of installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, and some might be ready for use within a short time. The evidence was compiled into briefings and presented to senior officials. When the photographs were shown to President Kennedy, the abstract fear of Soviet encirclement became a concrete, urgent reality. Inside the White House, Kennedy moved quickly to create a small, secret group to manage the crisis. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, brought together top civilian and military leaders, intelligence chiefs, and trusted advisors. They met in cramped rooms and around long tables, sometimes late into the night, debating what to do. The stakes were clear. Any response had to remove the missiles from Cuba without triggering a nuclear war. The options on the table were stark. Some advisors argued for a sudden airstrike to destroy the missile sites before they became fully operational, possibly followed by an invasion to topple Castro once and for all. Others warned that such an attack, especially without warning, could kill Soviet personnel and provoke retaliation against American allies, particularly in Europe, where US and Soviet forces faced each other across the dividing line of the Cold War. Diplomats urged a more measured approach, combining pressure with negotiation. A naval blockade, renamed a quarantine to ease legal and political concerns, emerged as a possible middle course. a show of force that stopped further shipments to Cuba while leaving room for diplomacy. As the debates raged, the dangers of escalation loomed over every conversation. Military planners described scenarios in which an attack on Cuba might trigger Soviet moves against Berlin, or lead to clashes that spiraled into a general war. Intelligence estimates, however uncertain, suggested that once the missiles in Cuba were operational, any conflict could quickly become nuclear. Kennedy listened, questioned, and weighed the arguments. In the end, he chose the quarantine, a line at sea that Soviet ships would be ordered not to cross, backed by the threat of further action if the missiles were not removed. Before the United States could confront the Soviet Union directly, Kennedy had to confront his own public and the world. For nearly a week, the crisis had been managed in strict secrecy while options were considered. Now, speechwriters and advisors worked to craft a televised address that would inform Americans of the danger without causing panic, and that would rally allies while leaving a door open for a peaceful resolution. Every word was scrutinized, every phrase tested for its diplomatic and psychological impact. On the night of the address, Americans gathered around their television sets as the president appeared on screen. Calm but firm, he described the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, explained the nature of the threat, and announced the naval quarantine. He demanded the removal of the missiles and declared that any nuclear attack launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union itself, met with a full response. Around the world, governments and citizens absorbed the news with a mixture of shock, fear, and grim recognition. The Cold War had entered a new and perilous phase. In the days that followed, newspapers splashed maps and diagrams across their front pages. Radio and television commentators dissected the president's words. Allies consulted urgently with Washington, some expressing support, others worrying about being dragged into a conflict. At the United Nations, diplomats prepared for heated debates and dramatic confrontations. The crisis was no longer a secret. It was now a global spectacle. On the high seas, the quarantine took shape. Lawyers in Washington had argued that a traditional blockade could be considered an act of war under international law. By calling it a quarantine and framing it as a defensive measure to prevent the spread of offensive weapons, the United States sought to maintain a legal and moral high ground. The distinction was subtle, but in the charged atmosphere of the Cold War, words mattered. The U.S. Navy surged into the Atlantic and Caribbean. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and patrol planes formed a cordon around Cuba, establishing checkpoints where Soviet and other ships could be intercepted and inspected. Rules of engagement were carefully drawn. Captains were instructed on how to signal approaching vessels, how to demand that they stop, and, if necessary, how to compel compliance without firing the first shot. Every encounter at sea carried the risk of misinterpretation, of a nervous commander overreacting in the heat of the moment. As Soviet cargo ships steamed toward the quarantine line, American and Soviet sailors watched each other across the waves. In operations rooms and on bridges, officers tracked radar blips and plotted courses on charts. Messages flashed between Washington and Moscow, each side probing the other's intentions. Some Soviet ships slowed or turned back before reaching the line. Others continued on, testing how far the United States was willing to go. The first close encounters were tense but restrained. Signals exchanged, courses altered, confrontations avoided at the last minute. Yet the sense of a world balanced on a knife's edge only deepened. Far from the decision rooms and command centers, ordinary people felt the crisis in more personal ways. In American cities and small towns, civil defense drills took on a new urgency. Families checked fallout shelters, stocked pantries, and whispered about evacuation plans. Children practiced duck-and-cover routines at school, not fully understanding that the weapons now in play could render such precautions meaningless. In Europe and elsewhere, citizens watched anxiously, aware that their countries might become battlegrounds or targets if war erupted. Allied governments scrambled to assess the situation. Members of NATO weighed their obligations and vulnerabilities, knowing that any Soviet move against Europe could draw them into a conflict they had long feared. Within the Warsaw Pact, Soviet allies watched Moscow's maneuvers, some with loyalty, others with quiet apprehension. In Havana, Castro braced for the worst. Convinced that an American invasion was imminent, he mobilized Cuban forces, readied militias, and prepared his people for sacrifice. To him, the crisis confirmed that Cuba's revolution was under siege and that martyrdom for the cause was a real possibility. At the United Nations, the confrontation took on a theatrical intensity. In a packed Security Council chamber, the U.S. representative challenged the Soviet delegate to admit the presence of offensive missiles in Cuba. The Soviet side denied or deflected, accusing the United States of aggression and hypocrisy. Then, in a dramatic moment, American officials unveiled photographic evidence. Blown-up images of missile sites, launchers, and support equipment on Cuban soil. The display undercut Soviet denials and rallied international opinion behind the American claim that a grave threat had been introduced into the Western Hemisphere. Even as diplomats argued, the military machinery of both superpowers moved to higher states of readiness. In the United States, alert levels were raised. Strategic forces were placed on heightened alert, aircraft were readied for rapid takeoff, and units around the world prepared for possible orders. The abstract concept of DEFCON, Defense Readiness Condition, took on a chilling reality as the number dropped closer to wartime posture. In the Soviet Union, parallel measures were taken, even if less visible to Western observers. The risk of accidental war grew with each passing day. Over Cuba, a U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down, killing its pilot. In Washington, many saw this as an escalation that demanded a response. Some military leaders urged immediate retaliation against the Cuban air defenses, a move that could have drawn Soviet forces directly into combat. Kennedy and his advisors hesitated, unsure whether the order had come from Havana or Moscow, and wary of steps that might close off paths to a peaceful resolution. Elsewhere, the fog of crisis produced its own dangers. Another U-2, on a separate mission near the Soviet Arctic, strayed off course, briefly penetrating Soviet airspace. Soviet fighters scrambled, and American jets, some armed with nuclear weapons, were dispatched to escort the wayward plane home. For a tense interval, a navigation error threatened to spark a direct clash between nuclear-armed forces. That it did not was due less to careful planning than to luck and restraint in the moment. Beneath the waves, the crisis pressed, on men inside cramped submarines. Soviet submarines operating near the quarantine line found themselves harassed by U.S. Navy ships dropping practice depth charges as signals to surface. Inside the sweltering, noisy hulls, cut off from reliable communication with Moscow, Soviet commanders and crews struggled with exhaustion, fear, and confusion. Some of these submarines carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes, weapons that could have inflicted catastrophic damage on American ships. In at least one case, the decision whether to arm and possibly fire such a weapon came down to a small group of officers under enormous psychological strain. Their choice to hold back helped keep the crisis from spinning out of control. While the world watched the visible maneuvers at sea and in the air, a quieter struggle unfolded in private channels between Washington and Moscow. Khrushchev sent a first message to Kennedy that was emotional and personal in tone. In it, he spoke of the horrors of war and suggested a path out of the crisis. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. The letter was rambling but conciliatory, offering a glimpse of a leader who understood the stakes and was searching for an exit. Before the United States could respond, a second message arrived from Moscow. This one was more formal, more rigid, and more demanding. It linked the removal of missiles in Cuba to the removal of American missiles stationed near the Soviet Union, particularly in Turkey. The contrast between the two letters reflected tensions within the Soviet leadership and the competing pressures Khrushchev faced from hardliners and military commanders. In Washington, Kennedy and his advisors debated how to interpret and answer these conflicting signals. They decided to publicly respond to the first, softer message, accepting in principle the trade of missiles in Cuba for a non-invasion pledge, while privately addressing the second demand. To manage the delicate matter of American missiles in Turkey, an issue that touched NATO unity and domestic politics, they turned to a secret back channel. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, met quietly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington. In a tense and carefully worded conversation, he conveyed the U.S. position. The United States would publicly promise not to invade Cuba and would privately signal its willingness to remove certain missiles from Turkey at a later date, as long as this part of the arrangement remained secret. The message was designed to give Khrushchev something he could present as a victory at home, without undermining the public stance of the United States and its allies. In Moscow, Khrushchev weighed this offer against the mounting risks. Soviet ships were approaching the quarantine line. Missile sites in Cuba were nearing operational status, but not yet complete. The possibility of a clash at sea, an airstrike, or an invasion grew with each day. Ultimately, he chose to step back from the brink. In a radio broadcast, he announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle and remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. The world exhaled, even as details remained to be worked out. In the aftermath of the announcement, attention turned to verification. American reconnaissance flights resumed over Cuba, photographing the dismantling of missile sites, the removal of launchers, and the loading of equipment onto Soviet ships. Each image that showed a missile being taken away was a small reassurance that the immediate danger was receding. On the ground, however, tensions remained. Castro, angered that Cuba had been excluded from the final negotiations, bristled at the idea of foreign overflights and inspections. He felt that his country's sovereignty had been bargained over by distant superpowers without his full consent. Gradually, as evidence accumulated that the missiles were indeed being removed, the United States began to ease the naval quarantine. Warships pulled back from their forward positions. Alert levels were reduced. Soldiers and airmen who had been poised for combat returned to more routine duties. The crisis that had dominated headlines and haunted private conversations for nearly 2 weeks began to give way to a fragile normalcy. Yet the political and personal consequences of the standoff lingered. For Kennedy, the resolution of the crisis burnished his image as a cautious but firm leader who had resisted pressure for immediate military action and steered the country away from nuclear war. For Khrushchev, the outcome was more complicated. While he could claim that he had secured a U.S. non-invasion pledge and, secretly, a commitment on missiles in Turkey, many in the Soviet leadership saw the withdrawal from Cuba as a retreat under American pressure. His standing at home and within the communist bloc suffered, contributing to his eventual removal from power. For Castro, the crisis was a bitter experience. He had welcomed Soviet missiles as a guarantee of Cuba's security and as a symbol of revolutionary strength. To see them removed without his full participation in the decision was a humiliation. His distrust of both superpowers deepened, even as he remained aligned with Moscow. Cuba's sense of isolation and vulnerability persisted, shaping its policies for decades to come. On a broader level, the Cuban Missile Crisis forced the superpowers to confront the terrifying reality of their own capabilities. Both sides had come face to face with the possibility that miscalculation or miscommunication could lead to mutual destruction. In response, they began to develop new mechanisms to manage future crises. A direct communication link, often referred to as the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow to allow leaders to speak quickly and clearly in moments of danger, reducing reliance on slow and unreliable diplomatic channels. The crisis also gave momentum to efforts at arms control. Recognizing the need to place some limits on the nuclear arms race, the United States, the Soviet Union, and other powers moved toward agreements that would restrict certain types of nuclear testing and lay the groundwork for later treaties. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, which curtailed nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, emerged in part from the sobering lessons of October 1962. It was an early step in a long and incomplete journey toward managing the nuclear threat. Strategists and military planners reevaluated their doctrines as well. The experience of standing so close to nuclear war highlighted the importance of restraint, communication, and flexible responses. The idea that nuclear weapons could be used in a limited, controlled way seemed less plausible after the world had glimpsed how quickly events could spiral. Crisis management, understanding how to signal intentions, avoid accidental escalation, and provide adversaries with a face-saving way out, became a central concern in both capitals. Over time, the Cuban Missile Crisis took on a near-mythic status as the defining example of Cold War brinkmanship. It illustrated both the dangers of pushing an opponent to the edge and the necessity of giving that opponent a way to step back. Historians and participants have offered differing interpretations. Some emphasize Kennedy's resolve and cool judgment. Others highlight Khrushchev's willingness to compromise. Still others point to the role of chance, misperception, and the courage of individuals at lower levels who chose not to pull triggers or launch weapons. Memoirs, declassified documents, and later scholarship have revealed how little each side truly understood about the other's intentions at the time, and how many deadly weapons were in play beyond what leaders in Washington and Moscow fully grasped. The crisis has been revisited in classrooms, war colleges, and policy debates as a case study in the limits of power and the necessity of empathy, even between adversaries. In the decades since 1962, new nuclear standoffs and great power rivalries have emerged. Different countries, different regions, and different technologies have taken center stage. Yet the echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis remain. Modern leaders facing nuclear-armed opponents still grapple with the same core dilemmas. How to deter aggression without provoking it. How to signal strength without closing off avenues for compromise. How to manage crises in a world where minutes can separate peace from disaster. Looking back on those 13 days, it is clear how close the world came to catastrophe, and how many factors, from high-level decisions to split-second choices by individuals, helped prevent it. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as both a warning and a lesson. A warning about the destructive potential of nuclear weapons and the perils of miscalculation, and a lesson in the value of communication, restraint, and the recognition that in a nuclear age, victory in war can be indistinguishable from defeat. As the maps and photographs fade, what remains is the enduring question it poses to every generation that inherits these weapons. Will we be as lucky and as wise